Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well in this difficult time. Thank you for joining us today for our conflict event. My name is Safa Lukili. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society. I'm also a master's student in environmental change and management here at Oxford. Our society is part of the Oxford University, and we aim to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we also run educational programs, including our School of Climate Change, and we are working currently with the university to implement net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculum. Today's event will address the potential effects of climate change on political stability, international peace, and conflict. In the past decades, there has been growing awareness of the security implications of climate change, not only relating to food and water security, but also in matters of political instability, intrastate conflict, mass displacements of people, and so forth. And studies have emphasized, among other cases, the link between the Arab Spring and rising global food prices related to droughts in major grain-producing nations. They have also emphasized the role of climate change in fueling intercommunal conflicts in Western Africa, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa, and also the weaponization of depleted water resources by terrorist organizations such as Boko Haram or ISIS. And beyond these events that we can already witness, ongoing climate-related phenomena raise certain security concerns, such as the expected internal mass displacement of over 140 million people by 2050, or the growing territorial claims and militarization over the Arctic. On the one hand, a growing number of institutes and research programs have emerged to study the implications of these trends. On the other hand, strong causal relations between climate change and conflict, at least direct relations, have been difficult to evidence, and questions still remain. So here we are today, and we hope to somehow contribute slightly to the conversation. So we have some questions. Does climate change actually cause conflict? If so, how? How can we prevent such an outcome? And how are climate decisions presently integrated into states' security policies? And to discuss these essential questions, I am delighted to welcome Professor Harvard Buhaug and Dr. Marcus King. Professor Buhaug is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He's also a professor of political science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and an associate editor of Journal of Peace Research. Dr. King is a senior fellow and member of the advisory board at the Center for Climate and Security. He is also a associate professor at the George Washington University in the USA, where he directs the Master of Arts in International Affairs program. Dr. King has extensive experience with climate change and energy issues in academia, policy research organizations, and the US government. And so we're really expecting a very rounded and kind of nuanced conversation. So we're going to start this event with each of the speakers giving a short introduction or speech with their thoughts on the topic. And that will be followed by questions from myself and then questions from you, the audience. So if you have any, please leave them and write them in the live stream chat on YouTube, and we'll make sure to address them. So thank you so much, Halvard and Marcus, for joining us today. So to start, Marcus, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. So I'll launch right into the three questions that were outlined. The first, of course, being very nuanced, and that is whether climate change actually causes conflict. So I thought at the onset, it would be important to define conflict, obviously what we're speaking about. So if the question is whether climate change can, generate some conflictual relationships between individuals, I think the answer is sort of an unqualified yes. I'm not a criminologist, but I do know there's been a lot of study on, for example, heat waves in urban centers, increasing crime, that sort of, level. But that's not really in what I would call my wheelhouse. My area has more to do with conflict at a larger scale and the prospects of state instability, as you mentioned. So the parameters that I use are generally violent conflict, and maybe approximately 25, 50 deaths on a battlefield. So that's sort of my unit of analysis is a little larger at that level. So I think that there are multiple drivers of conflict. And I'll tell you some of the ways or some of the approaches I think that climate change can be brought into that conversation. And as I said, fairly nuanced. So we've had an evolving understanding of the connection between climate change and conflict in the United States predominantly. I've spent about 15 years on different sides of this issue. I began in the policy arena in the Defense Department, in the only office ever named environmental security that's yet existed in the United States. It was the Deputy Undersecretary for Environmental Security at the Pentagon. We'll see if this changes after the next few weeks, but for right now, that was the only responsible position and office that really looked at climate stability. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the nuanced relationship between climate and conflict as seen through the eyes of some of the policy documents and initiatives that we have had in the US, because I've been more of a contributor toward that probably than the academic literature per se. So my experience began at a place called CNA Corporation, our Center for Naval Analyses. CNA is basically, if you're familiar, it's the RAND of the Navy. So RAND services the Air Force and the Army in the United States as a federally funded research and development center. And then CNA is the Naval Department of the Navy equivalent of that. So back in 2007, I was on a team where we convened 14 what we call flag officers. These are people that hold a 3 or 4 star rank in the military. We had 14 individuals on a panel that we composed to look over their years of operational experience to see if they had observed anything related to climate change while they were actually engaged in many cases in theaters of warfare. So what they had seen. We had 14 members, as I said, that equaled 500 years of operational experience. Each person had about 35 years experience. And also it's worth noting that they were very conservative. People that were initially climate skeptics had to take a step back along with our study team and think about climate change and whether it had any impact on their operations, at least in retrospect. So we found, I think the term might have already been used today, the idea that climate change could be a threat multiplier. So a threat multiplier would be the idea that climate change in and of itself doesn't cause conflict necessarily, but when combined with other what I call societal cleavages, such as sectarian differences, differences in economic status, maybe tribal, religious tribal differences, these sort of cleavages, these underlying social cleavages that exist can then be exacerbated by climate change and leading to conflict of some type. So what the Military Advisory Board, we called it, came up with the idea that climate change could act as a threat multiplier in some of the most volatile places in the world. So these are places that were already experiencing conflict, and then this conflict was being exacerbated. So that wasn't, an atmosphere of peace, and then all of a sudden there's these effects of climate change, and then that led directly to conflict. It was places where there already was conflict. So this frame then matured, I would say, around 2010, 2014. There was a document within the Defense Department called the Quadrennial Defense Review every 4 years. It's a major planning document from which all U.S. Military strategy is based. And so some of the work that we had done at the center and also in the intelligence community informed a new concept at that point in 2010, and that was that climate change could be what we referred to as an accelerant of instability. So that was a little different than a threat multiplier in the sense that the accelerant was placing more of a burden on institutions and armies that were already engaged in warfare. So it wasn't societal cleavages. It was more the idea that there was already a war happening, and then these institutions or these groups of intertribal conflict were then the instability was accelerated within that context. And so that was a guiding principle of military planning and doctrine around 2014. So moving forward to the present, I left the Center for Naval Analyses before I came to George Washington University. So I've been out of there maybe 9 years or so. And so what happened is after I left, there was a retrospective study conducted there looking to see how the world had changed from 2007 to 2014. I'm sorry, to the current time period. And so what was found then was that subsequent work within the military and the intelligence community began to see how climate change was actually creating new vulnerabilities. So this was the third concept that came along. And the new vulnerabilities and tensions, on the one hand, were seen against decentralization of power, were seen against the spread of extremism, and really contextualized within what in the United States we call the war on terror. And so what became at that point was the concept of climate change as a catalyst for conflict. So it was a driver. It wasn't the only driver. Perhaps it was Tinder, perhaps it was one of many drivers, but it was seen in this frame. And so this is probably the way that the defense community in the United States looks at it, but I'll be one of the first to recognize that the academic literature is very nuanced, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that. Um, and I would say that the academic literature doesn't necessarily recognize a causal relationship or even probably a catalyst for conflict. Um, but as I had said, in the policy arena anyway, we found that there's three ways in which climate change interacts with conflict. First, I had said, was the threat multiplier. Secondly, an acceleration of instability. And third, a catalyst for conflict. So we've noticed, just I'd say empirically, that these relationships exist, at least according to like the anecdotal narratives of those people who were engaged in combat over those years. So the bottom line, I would say, is climate change is generally not a necessary and almost never a sufficient variable in climate change. Sometimes it's necessary. It's almost never sufficient to explain what's happening. So the next question I was going to cover, was asked to cover, was discussing what mechanisms are that can contribute to competition over scarce resources or these social tensions that I mentioned in the context of the threat multiplier. So what I'd like to do is take a look at a concept I've developed for a new book that I'm working on. And so I wanted to share my screen here, and hopefully this will work. I'm never quite confident in these things. So we had originally called this the pathways of influence. So this was pathways of climate change leading to the eventuality of conflict. And so what you might notice here is I have water stress and conflict cycle. I don't have climate change and conflict cycle. And so to me, water stress has been sort of the most visceral, the most intense impact of climate change. So I looked at drought, and I've done that in the context of, as what has already been mentioned, in Syria and Iraq. And so I'm not saying that all drought is caused by climate change, although there's a high level of confidence that droughts have become more frequent and intense. So I wanted to at least make that distinction, because the work that I've done has to do with water scarcity, and water scarcity is a reasonable but also a poor analog in some ways for a climate change. And so quickly, this was the story that I found in Syria and Iraq. It's been told a few times, but the idea was there were originally physical stressors on the water within the context of the Syrian area. There were higher temperatures, a little bit less groundwater, drought and desertification around the year 2011. This also coincided with the demographic explosion of internally displaced people, but also farmers, which had moved from their areas in one part of Syria and been displaced and sort of relegated to the peripheries of cities. And this was due to this systemic outcome of water scarcity, which became the decline in agricultural productivity of the wheat harvests, leading to some food scarcity, leading to the internally displaced people that I mentioned. So there was migration. This was what I call the human responses in this context. This led people to greater potential of adherence to extremism. And so we saw this play out in Daraa, which was one of the cities, or probably the city that sparked the Syrian uprising. As I had said, this is a story. There was migration. The migrants were relegated to the peripheries of cities. But then what are the effects of the conflict? Well, the conflicts, of course, the water stressors that already exist are amplified. Were there any, and this has happened in many contexts, was there the ability or desire to improve water policies, to improve environmental governance? This was made impossible by the conflict itself. So this increased the stress on water. And we found this in both Syria and then also quickly in the middle belt of Nigeria in the Sahelian region. We have some of the same stressors where we've got desertification and drought. There was sort of a worldwide drought around 2011, and so this was the time frame I looked at. And then looking at the middle belt in Nigeria, you had systemic outcomes with food insecurity, pastoralists versus herders. The herders had ancestral migration patterns for the cattle, which were interrupted. The herdsmen then encroached on the pastoralist lands, increasing competition for already scarce water. And again, the effects of the conflict was that the government of Nigeria did not have the capacity, and still probably doesn't, to implement land tenure policies and changes that would be necessary. You know, in terms of the farmer herder violence in Nigeria over significant periods of time, that has been more deadly than the violence perpetrated by Boko Haram. And most people wouldn't realize that. And so what I'd like to do is stop sharing this and then move on quickly. And so, the third question that I was going to address was, how can we avoid such outcomes? And so, in some ways it's difficult because whenever conflict's an outcome, and there are many drivers, there are so many different approaches to conflict prevention and avoidance. But I would say within the area of climate adaptation, climate change, as I had said, is magnifying the frequency and intensity of droughts. So this is really a development question for development agencies. In the United States, it would be the U.S. Agency for International Development. There is already a program called Feed the Future, which could use a lot more funding. Optimistically, it will receive that. What they do is they work with drought-resistant seed varieties, for example. So drought-resistant seeds could be one answer. But another big part of it, I think, is data sharing. So there's capacities resident in the U.S. government, in the natural sciences, in the earth observational sciences, in the data modeling areas, all of which could be brought to bear to share with some of these governments. And I think that would be one good step. So countries, I think, need to understand what their natural resource, what their natural resources are, what the holdings are, how much water exists in a region before they can begin, let's say, hydrodiplomacy or actually assessing what the resources are. So finally, the last question I had was, my timer's going off here. The last question I had was, how are these climate dimensions presently integrated into state security policies? And so I think in the United States, the answer is not well enough, but there's been a discussion for quite a while at the agency level. So the Defense Department itself, the intelligence agencies have been able to develop programming around assessing climate risks, ironically, without being able to use the word climate, if you can believe it. And so what they've done is they've gone through and purged the word climate change from a lot of their official documents and replaced it with resilience. The White House, in a way, didn't notice so much. And that was because a lot of this work, again, was done by people who had operational, observational experience and could keep it at that level. And so what we hope to see, is it's a concept that's developed at the Center for Climate and Security by Frank Femia and Kate Worrell, who are two of my colleagues there, which is what we call the the responsibility to prepare and prevent. So the United States, as I had said, has unique capacities that are relevant to Earth observation, to modeling. And our foresight with climate change is relatively solid compared to some other security risks. You know, an example that I always give my class was all sorts of uncertainty was presented by the Cold War in terms of whether there would be, you know, a nuclear Armageddon unleashed by one side or the other. You know, think about how many resources were mobilized by that, how the world was really formed around that concept. But with climate change, we know that some countries will be flooded out of existence by the end of the century. So to me, climate change is a known, you know, sort of weapon of mass destruction. And so if we know that, and we have a relative ability to model that against some other security threats, then it does create what we call this responsibility to prepare and responsibility to prevent. So it's getting the right information into the hands of the right people to form coherent international policies around conflict prevention and climate resilience. It's messengers in the scientific community being able to bring this type of information to policymakers. And this, I think, will begin to become more possible in the United States. But without, you know, explicitly framing the problem as climate change, I would say that the defense institutions in the US have been able to move under the radar, so to speak. There was a new what we call defense authorization bill, where money was provided to the Defense Department to look at their operations, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of changing roles and missions that are affected by climate change. And they had to provide a report to the Senate. And so all of this was sort of done, you know, within the security community, but without necessarily cognizance of the White House. So I think all these actions you know, by the United States are going to be insufficient, along with most countries, to adapt to climate change, and therefore to strengthen this idea of conflict avoidance without the long-term improvements and resilience that would have to do with joining international agreements to stabilize climate change once again.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's really interesting to see the perspective from the military experts in the US, how you moved from threat multiply and add the dimensions of acceleration, of instability, and catalyst of conflict, and also how ideological kind of movements or ideas can kind of prevent a more transparent and efficient preparedness. It's quite saddening. So I'll hand the floor over to Halvard for his speech.
Thanks, Safa, and thanks to Oxford Climate Society for inviting me to take part in this obviously both timely and interesting and very important seminar. So you posed 3 questions at the outset. I will try to respond to the first. I will also flip the coin a bit and look not only at how climate change may cause conflict, under what conditions that might happen, but also look at how conflict might contribute to increase society's vulnerability to climate change, which I think also is an important connection and direction to keep in mind here. I have a bunch of slides. I'll try to go swiftly through most of them in order to preserve enough time towards the end for articulating what I believe are the main takeaways from my contribution to this seminar. But I would like to start by providing some positive news or some optimistic perspective on what's going on in the world, because I think we've all felt on the body and mind the depressing times we're living in, not only because it's November and it's gloomy and dark outside, certainly it is in Norway, but also considering all other forms of or types of events that are unfolding in the world. So to give us all a slight break from those depressing news, let's have a look at some positive developments. If we look at the now recently ended Millennium Development Goals agenda, which has since, of course, been superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you read the final report from the so-called MDG agenda, you will see documentation of many important types of societal progress. So here are some graphs that show a remarkable reduction in global poverty, for example. On the top left, you will see that the rate of extreme poverty in the developing world dropped by 2/3 between 1990 and 2015. And the rate of children, or actually the number of children, who were unable to attend school dropped by almost half only since the year 2000. And also in terms of the number of malnourished people around the world, you can see a remarkable reduction over time, both in relative terms, but also in absolute numbers. And you can look at other dimensions of development, and you will find a documentation of similar positive change. The under 5 mortality rate dropped by half over the course of the MDG agenda. The number of, or the number of women dying in labor also dropped by half. And in fact, only since 2000, you will see that casualties to malaria has also dropped by 50%. So these are remarkable evidence of societal progress in the developing world. Also, when we look at armed conflict, and this graph shows the yearly total number of people killed in armed battles around the world, you can see a distinct downward trend throughout the post-World War II period. Obviously, there are peaks and dips throughout this period, but the long-term trend, I think, is quite unmistakable here. Even in the post-World War, in the post-Cold War period, we haven't really seen a dramatic increase in violence to the extent that you might believe from reading the news. And also when it comes to political institutions and democratization, it's possible to find evidence of positive change. So here you can see a graph showing the average democracy score of the globe, but also broken down by various world regions. And we're not going to go into detail about what is a democracy here, but this is a leading provider of statistics on political systems. And the solid dark line in the middle represents the global average. And you can see a distinct increase around the end of the Cold War period, the third wave of democratization. And even though we have seen a slight relapse and democratic progress in the last 5 or 10 years, the level of democracy in the world today is higher than 2 decades ago, and certainly higher than 3 or 4 decades ago. So again, this is an evidence of positive and welcome change. And then you might ask, what about the ongoing pandemic and the implications or the impacts of that pandemic, which obviously would be both a timely and also important question. Well, here is here's a projection from the World Bank provided in a report they released last month on the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. The orange line here represents the world evolving without COVID. And there are 2 alternative COVID scenarios, a middle of the road scenarios, effectively the light blue, and then a more pessimistic scenario, the darker blue projection, which suggests that the global rate of extreme poverty will increase from 8.4%, which is the level at the outset of this year, up to 9.4%, and then continuing at that level into next year. And if you then compare the impacts of COVID with the alternative or the counterfactual world without COVID in 2021, you see a dramatic difference. We're talking about possibly 150 million people who drop below the poverty line. And these are extreme numbers. I think it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to internalize and to really absorb and understand the devastation we're talking about here for individuals. At the same time, if we look at this in a slightly longer perspective, and you take the same projection compared to the alternative 2020 and 2021 without COVID pandemic, you will see that this setback is, in perspective, relatively modest. And I'm not denying the really terrible impacts of COVID. But if you look back only a few years, you will see that actually things appear to have been even worse off. You can do the same also with global development in undernourishment as a consequence of the pandemic. The FAO and collaborating institutions estimate somewhere between 80 and 130 million additional people living in hunger because of the pandemic. And this number is quite similar, unsurprisingly, to the number of extra people living in extreme poverty because of the pandemic. But again, if you compare that projection or that estimate to past trends, you will see that you don't have to go very far back in time before the world was even more alarming in terms of hunger and undernourishment in the world. So what does this mean? Well, obviously, the COVID pandemic is a major setback. It has pushed back societal and social development by many years, if not decades, in vulnerable societies. But even so, in the longer term, you will see that the positive trend is much stronger than at least current estimates of the setback, suggesting that as a global collective, we have never been better able to cope with climate change impacts than we are today. And of course, that's also necessary considering that climate change is providing new and ever more demanding challenges for us than what we have experienced in the past. But these points are also important when we discuss conflict and peace, because they have implications for the extent to which climatic conditions and climate change could increase conflict risk. And so that leads me to what is really the topic of this seminar. What about climate change and conflict? Is there a causal relationship between those two phenomena? And what does the scientific literature say about this link? Here's a slide that shows quotes from 14 scientific review studies scattered over the past decade or so. And they all have one thing in common. They conclude on a lack of robust and general relationship. There is one exception to that, by the way, but the large majority of scientific review studies on this slide, but also more generally in the literature, conclude that as of now, the evidence for a direct and general connection between climatic conditions and armed conflict is relatively weak and not robust to changes to the definition of conflict or changes to the indicator chosen to represent climatic changes, etc. And the IPCC, in their recent 1.5 degree report, also summarizes the literature in similar ways, referring to inconsistent associations and inconsistent relationships between climate change and armed conflict. Here's another study that involved a number of so-called experts or researchers who've published on connections between climate change and conflict. And instead of running statistical analyses on meteorological information and observed conflict, this study provides results from a survey of these experts and what the experts think about connections between climate and conflict in relation to other drivers of armed conflict. And if you look at this list, these researchers were asked to rank the most important drivers of armed conflict in the modern era, and climate variability and change appear towards the bottom of that list. It doesn't mean, of course, that climatic variability and change were considered irrelevant in this list or in explaining armed conflicts in the modern period, but it does mean that other factors were considered more important. 6 caveats about how we can interpret this seemingly lack of robust evidence for a connection between climatic conditions and armed conflict. First of all, the lack of a general association does not mean that climatic conditions cannot play a role, and in fact cannot play an important role in particular cases. That's important to keep in mind. So the literature does not rule out the possibility of climatic conditions playing a central role in particular cases. Second, the limited evidence for civil conflict, which really has been the predominant focus of the literature, at least until the last few years, and the lack of evidence for a connection to civil conflict doesn't mean that climatic conditions cannot influence other forms of violence in a more systematic and more powerful manner. And in fact, there seems to be more consistent evidence connecting climatic conditions with non-state conflict or communal violence, if you like. A third caveat that I think is worthy to keep in mind is that much of this research, again, at least until the last few years, focus on outbreak of violence. And even if the evidence for a connection to the outbreak of violence may be somewhat not robust, it doesn't mean that climatic conditions cannot have a more profound impact on how conflicts evolve in terms of the level of severity, geographic diffusion, their duration, etc. And again, there seems to be more consistent evidence suggesting that climatic conditions may prolong conflict rather than causing it to break out in the first place. A fourth and quite important caveat actually is that most of this empirical literature focuses on what we would call climate variability or short-term fluctuations in weather patterns, droughts, for example, or heat waves lasting a year or possibly even not even a year. That's not the same as climate change, which is a more gradual but permanent shift in weather system. It doesn't mean that evidence for climate variability has no implications for our understanding of consequence of climate change. It does, because we do know that climate change also have implications for climate variability, but we should exercise caution whenever we try to translate observations about how societies respond to weather fluctuations into judgments about how societies are likely to respond to a permanently shifted environmental condition. A fifth caveat also is related, is that these long-term and indirect associations, which certainly are plausible between climate change and conflict and insecurity, are much harder to detect and certainly much harder to quantify, and generally they are still largely unknown. And finally, limits to adaptation, but also potential tipping points in both in ecological systems, but also in social systems, means that the usefulness of really long-term projections about consequences of climate change for conflict and security, again, may have somewhat limited value. Okay, I'm speaking fast, but these are this is a lot of material to digest. So what about the reverse association? Armed conflict is development in reverse. Here are two maps. On the left, you can see prevalence of armed conflict and instability, with the orange and red countries suffering more from conflict and instability. And on the right map, you see the darker the color, the lower the rate of achievement of the now concluded Millennium Development Goals. And if you compare these two maps, you will see a high degree of correspondence. Countries with political instability and armed conflict are much less likely to achieve development goals than other countries. Here's a list of emergencies to watch out for and to prepare for and to prevent, released at the outset of this year. And the top 10 list of most likely and most severe humanitarian crises this year. And this was prior to the realization of the COVID pandemic. You will see that all of these countries, probably with the exception for Venezuela, have had a systematic and long-term political violence going on, which obviously is an important driver and an explanation for the humanitarian crisis. How does armed conflicts contribute to increased vulnerability? Well, there are a host of social, economic, and political and normative impacts of violence that in turn make societies, communities, households, and individuals more vulnerable to climatic conditions. And in fact, the evidence for conflict contributing to increasing vulnerability is much stronger and more robust than the evidence for climate variability and change increasing risk of a conflict. But even so, the term climate security typically tends to focus on how climatic conditions and climate change may contribute to conflict risk, and often do not take into account the reverse association. So to conclude, climate change is not likely in the foreseeable future to cause armed conflict in otherwise stable societies. But climatic conditions, climatic extremes may accentuate risk in societies already prone to conflict. I think this resonates well with what Marcus told us earlier. And climatic conditions may also worsen impacts of already ongoing conflict. Armed conflict, in turn, is an important driver of vulnerability to climate change. And thereby, you may have this vicious cycle of conflict increasing vulnerability to climate change impacts, and those impacts become more severe, affecting livelihoods, economic productivity, etc., which in turn may increase the likelihood of further violence. If I were pushed on what would be the most relevant policy implications from this brief summary of the literature, I would probably say something like the following. If peace building is our objective, climate mitigation is ineffective. It does not mean that climate mitigation isn't important, it is. But if peace building is what we are investing all of our cash in, there are more efficient ways of achieving the goal, most likely, than investing it all in climate mitigation. However, if climate resilience is our objective, investing all of our money in peace building in societies affected by conflict and instability is an essential and most likely the strategy that will give you the most return for your investment. Okay, thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Halvard. If you stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was really interesting, especially the fact that you emphasized the reverse associations, obviously, between climate vulnerability and conflict. I had a quite simple, maybe a bit of a irrelevant question to this, but about you put forward a graph that kind of looked at the main indicators or main drivers of conflict, right? So low socioeconomic development, low state capability, intergroup inequality, economic shocks were some of them, right? I'm quite perplexed by the fact that climate change could be disassociated with these trends, as in if we have climate change impacting, for example, the agricultural yields, and then we have like lower incomes in the agriculture or issues with the state ability to respond to the population's demands. Like how are these studies decoupling, let's say, disassociating these factors?
This is an excellent question and an important issue. So you're right that our best understanding of how climatic conditions affect conflict is that it works indirectly. We do not believe that civil wars start just because it is unusually warm today or this year, or because it didn't rain when it should have done. Rather, there are more immediate socioeconomic, demographic, political impacts that in turn could make a society more vulnerable to radicalization, to mobilization, or to other processes that in turn could lead to conflict, including also resource scarcity. When it comes to that particular study that you pointed to, that I showed a figure from, it is true that some of the leading explanations for civil conflict are in themselves sensitive to climate change. For example, economic growth. We do know that extreme weather events can have a devastating impact on short-term economic growth, in particular in agriculture-dependent economies, but also in cases where there is massive material destruction of physical infrastructure, for example. Mm-hmm. That would be a short-term effect, not necessarily a long-term effect, but you are right that climatic conditions may increase conflict risk, for example, by lowering economic productivity, by ruining crop yield, for example. Now, how do we account for that indirect association and compare that to the other explanations? Or to put it differently, how can we account for the full effect of climate, both working through the economy, working through political issues, working through resource scarcity, etc., and compare the full effect of climate with the full effect of non-climatic drivers? Now, that's a huge challenge. There are statistical methods to try to get around that and to isolate the climate impact on conflict. Mm-hmm. And studies that do that reveal that the explanatory power of climate is quite small. I mean, we're talking about maybe 1%, 2% of fluctuations in conflict risk. So almost all of the variation is explained by non-climatic factors. And also in this nature study, where again I showed this figure, states explicitly that most of these factors at the top were considered to influence conflict, not having climate as the primary driver, but independently from climate.
Okay. Thank you so much for the explanation, clarification. I have a question a bit, maybe related to the fact that we can not really put the finger on a very strong causal link now, but maybe in the future. So this is more a question for Marcus. I know that you work a lot on water stress and in the Middle East, and I had a question concerning the issue of water wars, right? So the argument has often been that water wars are a myth, and that transboundary water management issues have been resolved mainly through agreements and cooperation. One of the common cases cited is the 1994 Israel-Jordan Treaty, or the 2015 agreement between Ethiopia and Egypt. But we've seen in the past years that Israel, for example, has been politicizing the water issue in ways that it never did before. For example, in 2018, when it threatened to to reduce the water availability to Jordan. So do you think that there is a threat that this threat of emerging water wars could actually come to become a reality?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it is true that if there's scholars such as Aaron Wolf at the University of Oregon in the United States. He keeps something called the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database. And other scholars have looked back at the history of water cooperation, let's say versus conflict over maybe the last 2,500 years, way back into antiquity. And what people have found is that incidences of water cooperation generally far outnumber the incidences of conflict, although there are significant incidences of conflict. And so I think the water wars that have been predicted by 3 secretaries general in a row, for example, they're really looking at the interstate level, right? So we're talking about allocation of water resources around shared river basins. So shared river basins, for example, there are 145 countries in the world that all or part of the country's territory lies within a shared basin. And so what I found is that this is really more of a cause for cooperation. And so the way that I've sort of develop my research agenda is I've looked more at subnational issues. So not necessarily shared water boundaries, but what's happening within a country itself. This gets down to the aquifer. For example, this gets down to water stress on more of a local level. And so what I believe is that increased tensions will follow a little bit of the pattern I was mentioning for climate change. So there's what I would refer to as harbingers of conflict anyway, that are at the subnational level, and so what are those harbingers? Some of them are, again, these, going back to the idea of the threat multiplier, there's the societal and religious and communal sectarian cleavages that exist within a society when those are there. Another one might be unilateral development of infrastructure. So when a dam is built upstream, from another country that's a riparian, if that is done unilaterally, then that increases the risk. And also when there's not, the ability for a subnational actor to be constrained by international water law, right? So I've looked at extremist organizations, and their relationship is obviously not to a norm of cooperation, constructed by nation states. So, you referred to the situation in Israel, I think, regarding the Jordan River. There was something called the picnic table talks that occurred there in the 50s. And this was talks between the Jordanians, the Israelis, and the Palestinians. And so one sort of truism I think that has borne out is that cooperation between states can be a lot more common. It can be facilitated at the technical level. So these were hydrology, they were engineers, they were water specialists that had this sort of discussion and cooperation. And so I think sometimes when things are held, not at the political level, but more at the technical level, there's more of a chance for this sort of cooperation, and that had been borne out within the Israeli, context with its neighbors. And so I would say two things, I guess, that in the future, there is, I think, more of an atmosphere of scarcity of the water itself, so that's a driver that might mitigate against cooperation. So it's one of these things on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a opportunity for the Israelis in terms of what I would call hydro diplomacy to, export some of the better technologies they have with desalinization, for example, drip irrigation methods. So there really is this opportunity, I think, for interstate cooperation, but within states, the picture is a lot more bleak in terms of subnational actors.
Okay, thank you for this. I find it really interesting the idea that really, again, we come back to the fact that climate change is not just happening in a vacuum. There are institutions that are in place, there are relationships that are in place, and if an issue of water management emerges between two countries that have somehow friendly terms, right? That's going to be very different than someone have an issue of previous conflict or tensions, and that's just going to come and kind of switch it, but it's not the kind of the issue, the main issue, I suppose. About the subnational kind of idea or subnational level as well. I had a question for both of you about displacement. So as I mentioned before, about 140 million people are expected to be displaced internally by 2050, but we also see that climate refugees could come and arrive in different countries, right? And this has already kind of sparked minor tensions. For example, just on the top of my head, the northern Brazil and the conflicts between Venezuelan refugees and the local population, because they thought that, oh, we already have like very fragile resources and jobs and all that, and that sparked some conflicts there. So what is your idea on this? Do you think that there is kind of the potential for this to become a real issue? Do you think this is going to be dealt with by developing new international treaties and all that? So if we can start with Halvard and your opinion on this.
Yes, thanks. Well, I think the impact of extreme weather events, but also in the longer term climate change and its influence on these changing events on displacement is real, and it is extremely worrying. I mean, already today and throughout history, extreme weather has always displaced people. And when more people live in exposed areas, they might migrate to the outskirts of cities that are more flood prone, for example. More people will be affected. Climate change is very likely to increase the number of displaced. I think that is a given. But the relationship between climate change and migration still isn't easy. For one reason, climate change might also reduce vulnerable populations' ability to move, because migration is also a coping strategy, a coping mechanism to deal with emergent or realized shocks, for example. And so if you're unable to move because you already lost your assets, for example, you will be most likely be even worse off than if you were able to move to the nearest city or to relatives across the border. And also because migration is part of adaptation and it's part of general development, trying to separate between that kind of migration that wouldn't have happened in the absence of climate change and that migration that clearly is driven by climate change, but has a positive impact because it is creating new opportunities for the migrants. And again, then the victims of displacement from climate change. I mean, these are complex questions that science is grappling with and increasingly trying to understand, obviously. So these are complex links. And then the next question is, okay, so what's the consequence of forced migration for conflict? And again, I think for every instance you hear about fighting over a water hole or frustration because the migrants steal our jobs or steal our public services, etc. For every story like that, there are many untold success stories where actually migrants and host populations live in tandem and live peacefully together. And so even in the massive displacement and migration crisis in Venezuela, where more than 3 million people have crossed the border in the matter of a few years, it's been remarkably peaceful, right? And to the extent that there is violence related to forced migration, it is much more often directed towards the migrants rather than the migrants triggering violence against the state or against a third group.
Thank you. I don't know what to say. Marcus wants to provide his own thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I agreed with a lot of what was just said, but I wanted to move in another direction because you referred to environmental or climate refugees. And right now we're in a situation globally, and I think for the foreseeable future, where there's not technically the idea of climate refugees doesn't actually exist, because the juridical definition of a refugee, part of that definition refers to someone who's been persecuted for political reasons or for belonging to a certain group or for their political beliefs. And so it's really, the term is really environmental migrants. But then why does this matter? Why does the terminology matter? I think it's because with refugees, the refugee status carries with it the right of asylum. So in that case, countries, the receiving countries would need to recognize the rights of those who are displaced by climate change as being refugees. And so the problem with that is, I think, as you said, by 2050, I think you quoted a number of 140 million refugees. I've seen the spectrum of 50 million to 150 million in estimates. And so at some point, the reactive capacity of countries to absorb this immigration will be exceeded. And then there's a question, is there any legal recourse? Is there any human rights law that's going to back that? all that said, the reasons for migration are complex. A lot of times it's poverty, and then the question is how much of the poverty has to do with climate change. But the idea of labeling climate refugees is fraught, because it's unlikely that the international community would come together and grant the status of refugees and therefore asylum. I worked on it's very difficult to project the future, but I worked on a climate simulation at the Emirates Diplomatic Academy in Abu Dhabi back in November, and we looked at the implications of environmental migration from Egypt, within about 20 years, and we found the possibility of 30 million refugees, and so 30 million environmental migrants. And then the question was, where would they go? If politics, God forbid, continue to be nativist, in Southern Europe, continue to be exclusionary, then the question is, will that change? Will there be outlets for people in the future based on changing political dynamics that will be more, tolerant of immigration? And so there has to be that political change, because I think there are discrete areas that within the next few decades, Egypt, for example, where there aren't a lot of options for migration for environmental migrants, or those that are migrating partially for environmental reasons.
Okay, thank you so much for putting more distinctions or more precision on the fact that obviously there isn't any legal term that's climate refugees, and that creates a bit of issues about the claim on refugees status and what comes with it. So I have one more question from myself, and then we have many questions from the audience, so I'll move to that after that. But my last one is a bit, I don't know, fantasist, maybe, I don't know, the tensions over the Arctic. So a lot of things have been said in the past years about, the Arctic, the receding cap, opening economic opportunities, new shipping alternatives, and massive oil and gas reserves, and Denmark and Canada and Russia putting down territorial claims, and it's not very defined who owns who owns what. So do you think that there's the potential of serious tensions arising in the future, or do you think this would just be settled through organizations? Yeah. So if maybe we can start with Halvard's opinion on this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I live in an Arctic country, so I should know this, but I regret to inform you that I'm really no expert on Arctic security. I know there is literature, but I simply have not made myself up to date on it. But is there a potential for serious tension in the Arctic? Absolutely, I think definitely so. Both with shipping lanes being increasingly open now that the Arctic ice is retracting, but also then the prospect for a resource competition, not only petroleum, but I believe there are also minerals that potentially could be extracted by multiple actors in the Arctic region. Is it likely that this will result in armed confrontation? Less so. But again, I'm no expert on the Arctic. So I tend to think that cooperation will prevail in the Arctic, as it tends to do in other theaters around the world, even when resources are scarce and prices are high, and therefore also stakes are high. Cooperation tends to win over conflict, but we certainly cannot dismiss, I think, the potential for increased tension and show off of military strength, for example, also in the Arctic.
Okay, maybe we can have Marcus perspective on this as well.
Yeah, so I'm skeptical about increased tensions in the Arctic getting to the point of armed conflict, certainly, or maybe even territorial conflict. But I would start with energy. What we call the shale oil and gas revolution in the United States and the lower 48 has been such a magnitude of discovery of new oil that the price of oil has really, gone down and been depressed. And so if that's true, then the question is the oil in the Arctic, which is still hard to get at, is it what you would say economically exploitable? And so right now, the world price of oil doesn't provide incentive for Arctic exploration. So for example, Shell Oil had a rig that was just north of Alaska that they deactivated because the prices were just too high, at this point to exploit the oil. So the oil's not economically exploitable. So that's one thing that would maybe ease the scramble for resources. And then another has to do with the territorial disputes that you alluded to. The Northern Sea Route, which is actually on the Russian side of the Arctic, if you're picturing it, the Northern Sea Route is essentially granted to be Russian internal waters. So there's not an active territorial dispute on that side. On the other side of the Arctic, if you can picture it, is the Northwest Passage. Northwest Passage is melting at a lower rate than the Northern Sea Route. So it won't be, as they say, ice-free, which is kind of a misnomer. There's actually going to be a lot of icebergs. There's a lot of navigational hazards. But the main territorial dispute actually exists between the United States and Canada. So there's probably, the ability for the United States and Canada to come to terms over that. So the territorial disputes are latent, I would say. And so, I was part of a study in the U.S. National Academies of Science that was looking at requirements for surface warships in the Arctic. Would there be a need for that? Would there be a need for ice-hardened hulls on warships? And what we found looking at that was that it's really a lot more of a, for the United States, a Coast Guard mission, in the sense that you've heard of cruise ships that have done partial transits across the Arctic. Maybe they would be in distress, so that'd be a search and rescue mission. Maybe there's environmental impacts of some of the exploration that's going on up there, small oil spills. So it's really sort of a non-military, the need for response is non-military, but there needs to be expanded capabilities, and more icebreakers for the United States is a big part of that, because the Russians have a lot more. But finally, I would just cap the, it's a rich topic that I've studied a lot, but I would just cap it off by saying that the institution that exists there for cooperation is the Arctic Council. In all countries that have territory in the Arctic belong to the Council. And then there's some that have observer status, which make people nervous, like China. But it's in the organic statute of the Arctic Council that it does not deal with military and security matters. So it's basically economics. And so if there were to be increased tensions, which is very plausible, there's not an institutional outlet that exists that would allow for arbitration of these tensions. And then the United States not belonging to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea is another limitation toward mitigating conflict as it tends to escalate. So there's some warning signs institutionally there, but generally I think it's an overblown idea that there would be like a territorial dispute that would result in armed conflict.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this relocation or on where the conflict or the tensions could come from. Talking about institutions, we have one question from our audience on whether NATO has a policy program on this issue and what they're expecting. Halvard, if you want
to... I was just going to suggest that maybe Marcus has some insightful comments on that.
Yeah, I have a few. So to me, I think, institutionally, NATO has been working toward finding relevance, and really understanding what package of issues they would be addressing as an alliance. And so, yes, there is an activity within NATO that has been focused on environmental security. I actually had a capstone team here at the Elliott School at George Washington University where they looked at NATO threat assessments and then tried to mainstream environmental considerations into the existing threat assessments. So they're looking at country studies and then thinking about how environmental security would play into the overall situation there. So that activity exists. You know, there's a unit that works on that and forecasting within NATO. They've published some studies over the years. And I think it's an area of where the existing capacity of NATO could probably be leveraged a bit more to look at these issues. But yeah, NATO's you know, been involved to some degree in the environmental security arena.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question about oil. Do you believe there will be any conflict when the global oil peak is reached, and will the post-peak depression feasibly cause interstate conflict or intrastate conflict? I would more lean towards, but if maybe we can hear from Halvard on this one.
Yeah, good question. My primary concern when it comes to peak oil and in fact the declining demand for oil as we move into the next decades, and therefore also presumably declining prices of oil, is the economic implications and then the societal implications for major oil exporters, for example, in the Middle Eastern region. How are they going to handle this transition from a petro economy to a non-petro economy? Presumably that process will take a long time, and they are to some extent already preparing themselves, at least some countries are, trying to widen their economic portfolio to also include finance, to some extent tourism, etc. But I'm more concerned about the long-term security implications of declining demand for those oil exporting countries than I am about the prospect of countries fighting over oil in the future.
Okay. I suppose also because of the patronage system in most of the Gulf countries, the fact that they won't be providing anymore or won't be able to provide as much subsidies or support to the tribes might play a role on this. I have another question here about conflict resolution. So can you provide information as to what types of conflict resolution methods are being employed? I suppose as well, considering climate dimensions. Maybe Marcus, we can hear from you.
So conflict resolution mechanisms that are employed. In the countries I've studied, I think I mentioned Nigeria earlier. I just, you know, I've heard this so many times, but it's very important to work on conflict mitigation and at the local level, because there are so many countries where, as I had mentioned, perhaps the security situation on the ground prevents good policy making, bringing together the parties for conflict resolution. So the more that it can be done on a local level, the more effective it is seen to be. And then also if there is any endemic corruption within, the country where the conflict's happening to begin with, and that's very likely. So local actors who understand the situation the best, getting the money directly to them and the assistance directly to them if possible to get on the ground that closely. And then I can't, fail to mention the gender component in all of this, because so frequently empowering women, especially at the local level, has brought about, the best results, and they've been able to, maintain the best resources that they possibly can. And just tend to be invested in sustainable development in a way that has really been instrumental to conflict resolution on the local level.
I think it's really interesting that you raised the gender elements on this. We had an event last week about this, and I was just reading an article yesterday about the fact that women have been using the social capital to kind of push forward conflict, like dispute settlements and conflict resolution. There's another question about, so climate impacts are going to significantly worsen in non-linear fashion, potentially with tipping points being triggered. To what extent can we really extrapolate the link with conflict that we see today to the future?
Only to a limited extent is my very short answer to that. So up until now, our conflict forecasting abilities have been at the level of meteorological forecasting before we had satellites and remote sensing, meaning that our best projections about tomorrow's conflict situation is to look at the situation today. The best indication of tomorrow's weather is to look at the weather today. Most of the time, that's a pretty accurate prediction, but obviously a few times it can be a complete miss. And the further ahead you look, the less accurate that prediction is. So I think I can provide a fairly accurate prediction of where we will see conflict and instability in December of 2020. Less accurate in December of 2021. And if we move decades into the future, so many things will happen, not only in terms of potential nonlinear impacts of climatic conditions on agricultural productivity, for example, or on water consumption or energy consumption, but on a host of other societal dimensions. So that becomes extremely challenging. And so what scholars do then, instead of trying to do simple prediction based on statistical relationships today, is to try to create some scenarios where you can make assumptions about these changes that could be nonlinear, for example, on certain variables. And then you can model those results into the long-term future. And those simulations are not intended to be accurate predictions in the sense that weather forecasts are, but rather they are intended to explore a wide set of alternative futures and see, okay, so if you follow this path, that's where we're likely to end up. But if we change the parameters, this is where we're likely to end up. So it's more like a mapping exercise of the full scope of likely future implications for conflict, for example.
Thank you. Marcus, do you want to add something to this, or we can move to another question, whatever you want?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to say that, you know, the challenge here is looking, you know, as Harvard was saying, at the scenario building and the alternative futures. And so the idea is to marry the climate models along with socio-political analysis. And these are done by very different communities. So you can look at the various climate models that exist. You know, they're looking at the regional concentration pathways, the amount of, and that is very dependent on how people behave, you know, how much renewable energy is introduced into the system. And so you can look at those alternative futures. But that is really the climate scientists. And then you've got a group of people that follow the socioeconomic developments. And so the only thing I could say is there has to be better communication between those two communities in order to probably come up with the best set of answers. But the other thing I would mention is that the, you know, sort of time that you can forecast the outcome of a climate model with any fidelity and socio-political modeling is probably, you know, 5 years or something in the future. So there's a very narrow window, but there is a window, I think, where you could get together the suites of models, both from the socio-political analysis and the climate and, you know, scientists, in order to develop ideas in like the very sort of short run, 0 to 5 years. And that, of course, doesn't account for the tipping points.
Yeah, I suppose interdisciplinarity seems to be a recurring theme when we talk about climate change and climate related issues. So just one more question, and maybe you can incorporate with it your final statements as we are nearing the end of the event. So could the discursive framing of climate change-driven migration as a cause of extremism risk weaponizing the vulnerabilities of displaced people, the wealthy treating vulnerable people as a security threat, basically? Yeah. So Halvard, maybe we can, if you want to contribute on this.
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. The securitization of forced migrants is a real concern. And you do see pockets of resistance towards immigrants in the European Union, for example. We've had the so-called migrant crisis going on over the past 5 years. And while much of that has gone well, and a number of migrants have been able to settle in Europe, some of that migration process obviously has led to casualties along the way, which have been catastrophic and terrible, but also in many cases, the immigration and integration into Europe have not necessarily succeeded to the extent that neither the migrants themselves, nor the host societies, nor the authorities really wanted. And to some extent, asylum seekers also have been blamed for being bogus refugees, in effect being opportunists and economy-seeking migrants rather than true refugees that they claim to be. That's been the rhetoric, and you have seen increasing support for populist parties, populist movements in Europe over the past few years. I think we should be careful about attributing all of that, or a given fraction of that, to the large volume of migrants and asylum seekers arriving in the last few years. But I think that's part of the process. And to the extent that these migrants are seen as cynical and bogus, obviously that has negative impacts for these migrants' opportunity to settle and integrate into European society. Just to use Europe as the case of example in my response.
Thank you, Halvard.
So could I jump in on that question as well? Or I guess this is our final question. Yeah, so I wanted to provide a counterexample from the United States and Central America. You know, there's an area called the Northern Triangle of Central America, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And those countries have all seen environmental scarcity, if not, you know, the direct effects of climate change. And so part of the narrative is that the migration into the United States is not all from Mexico. It's many people transiting Mexico. And many of these people from the Northern Triangle, Central America, have at least in part some environmental, you know, reasons for moving. You know, in El Salvador, people have moved from the farm rural areas to the cities, which are incredibly violent. And so I think I've always been careful, though, because if it's seen in the United States that climate change or these environmental scarcities are a driver, that's a problem in terms of securitization, because the idea is that, and I think the real fear is you know, the militarization aspect of securitization, and that's basically that the fear that the military instrument of power is going to be used to respond to the type of phenomenon it can recognize, right? So maybe that's DHS, the Homeland Security Agency in the United States. You know, it's the idea of how can we build bigger walls, you know, and so I think a more expansive definition of security, you know, needs to include human security, and that needs to be inculcated in American policymaking. So you still understand that there are environmental scarcities that might be driving migration, but then it's working to do sort of the exact opposite of what the current administration did, which is they took away all aid from Guatemala. They just ceased development assistance to Guatemala. And so to me, it's solving the issues where they originate, so there isn't this urge to securitize or militarize. And so it's increasing development assistance, and then climate sensitive development assistance like climate finance, for example, to help build resilience in these countries. And so there really is that danger, though, of securitization, especially in a very sensitive issue in the United States, which is migration.
Thank you so much for your insights. This has been a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm very happy that you decided to join us. I'm just going to tell our viewers about our next event next Monday, again, about climate. So this is going to be about the links between food security and climate, and the role of climate smart security, climate smart agriculture, soil erosion, and we're gonna be joined with Professor Tim LaSalle from the California State University. He's an expert on agroecology. So Monday, 7 p.m. Yeah, I hope to see you then. I will now stop the live stream. Take care.